The man who played an invincible mutant that could heal from any wound has undergone 7 surgeries for skin cancer that keeps returning, watches his body fail to produce what medicine calls impossible to heal, and recently saw his 27-year marriage dissolve into joint statements about pursuing individual growth. Hugh Jackman, who taught us that Wolverine could survive anything, now spends mornings in dermatology offices having pieces of his face removed, takes anxiety medication. He hid for 20 years and admits he still sets the dinner table for 3, even though Deborra-Lee hasn't lived there since 2023. Behind that Broadway smile lies a man whose mother Grace walked out when he was 8 years old, driving away one morning and never coming back, who spent decades perfecting happiness on stage while battling depression so severe he once planned exactly how he'd end everything between Wolverine films. What you're about to discover will shatter the image of Hollywood's most cheerful leading man, a boy abandoned who became a man who abandons himself in every role. If Hugh Jackman ever made you believe in heroes, leave a like and subscribe below. There's a moment in Hugh Jackman's childhood that explains everything. Standing at the window of their Sydney home on September 3, 1976, watching his mother Grace McNeil pack her suitcase into a taxi, while 8-year-old Hugh pressed his small hands against the glass, not understanding that when mothers leave for a little trip to England, sometimes they never come back. Long before the world would know him as Wolverine, he was Hugh Michael Jackman, the youngest of 5 children, learning that love could simply walk out the door one morning and choose to stay gone. Grace left behind her husband Christopher, an English-born accountant who'd brought the family to Australia for a better life, and 5 confused children who would spend decades wondering what they'd done wrong to make Mummy disappear. The abandonment wasn't dramatic. No fights, no thrown dishes, just a quiet desertion that made it worse. Grace had been struggling with what Hugh would later understand was severe depression, overwhelmed by 5 children and a marriage that had transplanted her from England to Sydney suburbs. She kissed Hugh goodbye that morning, like any other day, said she'd be back soon, then flew 10,000 miles away and decided to stay there. "I thought it was my fault," Hugh would admit 40 years later in therapy. 8-year-olds think everything is their fault. I spent decades trying to be perfect enough that she'd come back. Christopher was left to raise 5 children alone, 2 daughters who'd eventually moved to England with Grace, and 3 boys who stayed in Sydney with their father. Hugh, being the youngest, bore the unique weight of watching his older siblings at least have memories of a complete family, while his earliest memories were of absence. His father, drowning in his own abandonment trauma, threw himself into work, leaving at dawn and returning after the boys were asleep. Dad was physically present, but emotionally devastated, Hugh reflected. He kept us fed, clothed, in school, but he couldn't give what he didn't have: emotional availability. The silence in the house was deafening. Nobody talked about Grace. Photos of her disappeared. Her name became forbidden. When kids at school asked about his mother, Hugh learned to lie. She was sick. She was traveling. She was anything but gone. He'd watch other boys get picked up by their mothers after school, their casual complaints about embarrassing mums feeling like knives. "I would have taken any embarrassment over emptiness," Hugh later said. Even bad attention from a mother seemed better than no mother at all. Hugh developed what psychologists would later identify as hypervigilance and people-pleasing as survival mechanisms. He became the perfect student, the helpful son, the boy who never caused trouble because trouble might make Dad leave too. He'd wake at 5 a.m. to make his father breakfast, trying to fill the space Grace left. He'd help his brothers with homework, clean obsessively, perform happiness so convincingly that teachers praised Christopher for raising such a well-adjusted boy. "I learned that if I was perfect enough, helpful enough, happy enough, maybe people would stay," Hugh explained. Performance became survival. The reunion attempts were perhaps crueler than the abandonment. Grace would call occasionally, her voice distant over international lines, promising visits that rarely materialized. When she did return, once a year if Hugh was lucky, the visits were strained performances of motherhood that confused more than comforted. She'd bring gifts from England, like apologies wrapped in paper, spend a week pretending normalcy, then leave again, each departure reopening wounds that never properly healed. The leaving was hard, Hugh reflected, but the coming back and leaving again was torture. It taught me that love was temporary, that everyone leaves, that I needed to be worth staying for, but never was. At 22, Hugh Jackman stood outside the Sydney Theatre Company in 1991, having just been rejected for the third time that month, told his look wasn't leading man material, and his 6'2" frame was too physically imposing for romantic roles. He was sleeping on his brother's couch in Neutral Bay, working as a PE teacher at Uppingham School for £18,000 a year, teaching kids rugby during the day while spending nights in amateur theater productions that paid nothing but promised exposure that never came. He'd graduated from the University of Technology, Sydney with a journalism degree he never wanted, then pivoted to a one-year teaching certification because it was practical, safe, what his father Christopher wanted, stability over dreams. There was no Plan B, Hugh would later admit. But Plan A required me to fail at everything safe before I could try anything real. Those first years were exercises in educated rejection. Hugh's drama coach at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, where he'd finally enrolled in 1991 after saving every teaching dollar, told him he had talent but lacked dangerous edge, was too eager to please, too desperate for approval. He'd auditioned for Sydney productions with Shakespeare monologues perfected in his bathroom mirror, only to be told he was technically proficient but emotionally absent. Between 1992 and 1995, he auditioned for over 200 roles, landing exactly 6, all in productions that closed within weeks, playing supporting characters who existed to make leads look better. The breakthrough from invisibility came through Corelli, an Australian television drama in 1995, where Hugh played a prisoner opposite Deborra-Lee Furness, an established actress 13 years his senior who saw something in the eager young man everyone else overlooked. Their first scene together required Hugh to be vulnerable, broken, and he channeled every moment of maternal abandonment into the performance. Deborah later recalled, "He was supposed to be acting devastated, but I saw real pain he didn't even know was showing." The show lasted only 10 episodes, was critically dismissed, but gave Hugh 2 things that mattered: his first real paycheck and Deborah's belief in him. The relationship with Deborah began as mentorship, but evolved into salvation. She was successful, confident, had worked internationally, everything Hugh wasn't but desperately wanted to be. She introduced him to agents, coached him through auditions, and most importantly, provided the first consistent presence in his life since Grace left. Deb saw potential I couldn't see, Hugh reflected. She loved me before I was worth loving, which I didn't think was possible. But fate's cruelest gift was getting cast in Oklahoma at the National Theatre in London in 1998, a triumph that meant leaving Deborah for 6 months just after their wedding. History repeating, someone leaving for England, promising to return. Hugh spent the entire run terrified. She'd realize he wasn't worth waiting for. He'd call at 3 a.m. Sydney time, needing to hear her voice confirm she was still there. The reviews were stellar. Hugh Jackman is a revelation, but he couldn't enjoy them, too anxious about abandonment to celebrate success. The pattern of overwork as anxiety management intensified. Between Oklahoma and X-Men auditions, Hugh took any role offered: corporate training videos, commercials for carpet cleaning, a touring production of Beauty and the Beast, where he played Gaston to half-empty regional theaters. He was earning enough to pay rent, but not enough to stop the constant hustle, the perpetual fear that stopping meant disappearing. "I worked like someone was chasing me," Hugh admitted. Because someone was. The 8-year-old boy whose mother left. He was terrified that if I stopped moving, stopped achieving, everyone else would leave too. The role of Wolverine wasn't supposed to transform Hugh Jackman from unknown Australian actor to global superstar. He was the last-minute replacement after Dougray Scott got stuck filming Mission Impossible 2, literally called 3 weeks into production when filming had already started. Hugh was 31, had been in Hollywood for exactly one pilot season that yielded nothing, and was about to return to Sydney defeated when his agent called about replacing someone in a comic book movie. He didn't know who Wolverine was, had never read X-Men, and was 3 inches taller than the character was supposed to be. Director Bryan Singer's first words to him were, "You're too tall, too unknown, and too nice, but we're desperate." Hugh had 3 weeks to gain 20 pounds of muscle, learn to embody rage he'd spent decades suppressing, and convince studios to ensure an unknown Australian replacing their original star. Behind the scenes, Hugh's preparation was psychological excavation of carefully buried trauma. Wolverine's berserker rage required accessing anger Hugh had perfected, hiding behind show tunes and smiles. The character's abandonment issues, no memory of parents searching for identity, triggered every wound from Grace's departure. During the first scene where Wolverine wakes up screaming from nightmares, Hugh didn't need to act. "I channeled every nightmare I'd had about my mother leaving," Hugh later admitted. "Every time Wolverine couldn't remember his past, I remembered too much of mine." The physical transformation nearly broke him. Hugh was naturally lean from theater, but Wolverine required mass. He'd wake at 4 a.m. for 6,000-calorie meals that made him sick, train until muscle failure, inject legal supplements that made his joints ache. He kept Grace's photo in his trailer, using abandonment as fuel for Wolverine's rage. Between takes, he'd call Deborah obsessively, needing to confirm she hadn't left, that someone stayed. "I was becoming a character defined by anger while terrified of my own," Hugh reflected. When X-Men released in July 2000, Hugh's performance transformed him from nobody to somebody overnight. Critics who'd never heard his name suddenly called him revelatory, the film's dark heart, perfectly embodying rage and vulnerability. The film earned $296 million worldwide, launching a franchise that would define Hugh's career for 17 years. But standing at the premiere, watching himself embody indestructible rage on a 50-foot screen, Hugh felt like a fraud. "Everyone saw Wolverine's strength," he reflected. "I felt Hugh's weakness, the boy whose mother left, pretending to be invincible." But even at this pinnacle moment, darkness was already creeping in. The success triggered Hugh's first major depressive episode since childhood. The abandonment trauma he channeled into Wolverine didn't dissipate after cut. It intensified. He'd wake in cold sweats, convinced Deborah had left, checking she was still breathing next to him. The steroids required for Wolverine's physique affected his mood, swinging between mania during filming and crashes between movies. "Success felt like another performance," Hugh admitted. "I was playing confident movie star while the 8-year-old inside kept asking when everyone would realize I wasn't worth staying for." The transformation from theater unknown to action hero happened so fast Hugh couldn't process it. His quote went from $50,000 to $5 million overnight. Suddenly, everyone wanted the singing, dancing Wolverine, the contradiction that shouldn't work, but did. He was offered every superhero role, every action franchise, every opportunity he dreamed of while teaching PE. But each success felt temporary, each achievement like something that could be taken away. The boy who'd made himself perfect trying to make his mother return had become a man making himself perfect for millions, still performing for love that felt conditional. I succeeded at becoming someone else, Hugh reflected. The question was whether anyone would stay if I stopped. By 2008, Hugh Jackman wasn't just Wolverine. He was Hollywood's most versatile leading man, commanding $20 million per film, seamlessly transitioning from claws to chorus lines, hosting the Oscars while shooting X-Men Origins by day and performing in a steady rain on Broadway by night. His production company, Seed Productions, controlled his projects. He owned properties in Sydney, New York, and the Hamptons worth $40 million combined. The PE teacher from Sydney, who'd been told he wasn't leading man material, had become the only actor successfully maintaining careers in action films, musicals, and legitimate theater simultaneously. But even at this impossible peak, Hugh was secretly undergoing his third skin cancer surgery, hiding the bandages under Wolverine's makeup, taking anti-anxiety medication between takes, and calling Deborah obsessively between scenes to confirm she hadn't left. The 8-year-old boy's fear never leaving the 40-year-old man's success. The public saw endless triumph. Australia with Nicole Kidman, proving he could carry epics. The Oscars hosting Gig, earning standing ovations. X-Men Origins Wolverine, cementing his franchise ownership. But privately, Hugh was maintaining impossible standards through punishing routine. He'd wake at 4 a.m. for 2-hour workouts, eat 6,000 calories to maintain Wolverine's mass, then starve for shirtless scenes. Between films, he'd crash physically and emotionally, the absence of structure triggering abandonment anxiety. Success meant never stopping, Hugh reflected. If I stopped, people might leave. So I kept adding, more films, more shows, more achievements, like a shark that dies if it stops swimming. The relationship with Deborah had evolved into something beautiful, but complicated by their inability to have biological children. After multiple IVF attempts that failed, they'd adopted Oscar in 2000 and Ava in 2005, creating the family Hugh desperately wanted. But the adoption process had triggered every abandonment wound. Would he abandon his children like Grace abandoned him? Would they someday search for real parents? I loved them instantly and completely, Hugh said, but I was terrified I'd fail them the way I'd been failed. Working with directors like Christopher Nolan, Baz Luhrmann, and Darren Aronofsky, Hugh became known as the most professional actor on set. Never late, always prepared, emotionally available for every take. What they didn't know was this perfection came from terror of disappointing anyone. He'd learn every crew member's name, remember their children's birthdays, send thank you notes after wrapping. Hugh makes everyone feel like the most important person in the room, one producer observed. But it was performance, the abandoned boy ensuring everyone liked him enough to stay. Success is the most beautiful prison, Hugh told his therapist during this period. Everyone sees achievement, but I see a house of cards. One bad film, one missed note, one person leaving, and it all collapses. By 2009, at the absolute peak of his powers, Hugh Jackman had everything measurable: wealth, fame, family, respect, across multiple entertainment mediums. But he also had skin cancer recurring with increasing frequency, a marriage strained by his workaholic schedule, and children who knew Wolverine better than their actual father. The pinnacle moment that broke something came during The Boy from Oz on Broadway, playing Peter Allen, another Australian performer who hid pain behind entertainment. 8 shows a week, twice on Wednesdays and Saturdays, Hugh pushed through vocal hemorrhages, dehydration, and exhaustion that required IV drips between acts. He won the Tony, the highest honor in theater, but collapsed backstage after his acceptance speech. I'd achieved everything I'd dreamed of, Hugh reflected, but I was empty. The 8-year-old boy was still at the window, watching his mother leave, and no amount of applause could make her come back. Hugh's marriage to Deborra-Lee Furness in 1996 began as salvation disguised as romance. She was 13 years older, established in her career, the first person since his mother who chose to stay when she could have left. They met on Corelli when Hugh was nobody. Deb was somebody, and she saw through his performance of happiness to the abandoned boy beneath. Their wedding was small, intimate, Hugh crying through vows because someone was promising to stay forever, a concept he'd never believed possible. I married Deb quickly because I was terrified she'd realize I wasn't worth it, Hugh admitted years later. Every day she stayed felt like borrowed time. The marriage's foundation was beautiful, but complicated by their struggle to have biological children. 2 years of IVF attempts, multiple miscarriages Deb suffered while Hugh was filming, each loss another abandonment, children who left before arriving. The hormone treatments affected Deb's mood, the financial strain was enormous, and Hugh's response was to work more, earn more, be absent more. I thought if I was successful enough, the universe would give us children, Hugh reflected, like achievement could negotiate with biology. The adoption of Oscar in 2000 and Ava in 2005 should have been pure joy, but triggered Hugh's deepest fears. Would he abandon them like Grace abandoned him? Would they search for biological parents like he still searched for his mother's love? He overcompensated with perfection, never missing school events, even if it meant flying from film sets, learning every parenting book, performing fatherhood with the same intensity he performed Wolverine. I was so scared of failing them that I couldn't just be present, Hugh admitted. Every interaction was a performance of perfect parenting. The pattern that emerged over 27 years was Hugh's workaholism as anxiety management. He'd take back-to-back projects, filming Les Miserables, while prepping The Wolverine, while planning Broadway returns. Deb managed their home, raised their children largely alone, became CEO of their production company while Hugh performed happiness across continents. She'd later tell friends, "I was married to 3 people, Hugh the man, Wolverine the character, and the abandoned 8-year-old boy. Only one of them was ever fully present." But the deepest fracture came from what Hugh couldn't give, vulnerability without performance. Even with Deb, he maintained the show, the humor, the song and dance man who made everyone comfortable while never revealing discomfort. Their therapy sessions revealed Hugh couldn't fight with her, couldn't express anger, couldn't risk any negative emotion that might make her leave. 27 years, and he still expected me to abandon him, Deb would later reflect. That's exhausting, being someone's proof that people stay. The September 2023 separation announcement, Pursuing Individual Growth, was corporate speak for a marriage that had become caretaking rather than partnership. Deb had spent nearly 3 decades trying to heal Hugh's abandonment wounds while he spent those same decades performing happiness to keep her from leaving. The irony was devastating. His fear of abandonment created the distance that led to separation. "I became exactly what I feared," Hugh told his therapist. "Someone who gets left." Maybe that's what I always was, someone built for leaving. The aftermath was Hugh alone in their New York apartment, still setting 3 places for dinner from habit, calling out to tell Deb things before remembering silence. The abandoned boy, now an abandoned man at 55. The children, now adults, divided time carefully between parents, watching their father perform stability while obviously fragmenting. The thing about being left, Hugh reflected, is it confirms what you always suspected. that you were never enough to make someone stay. In March 2014, during a routine makeup session for X-Men Days of Future Past, the makeup artist noticed an irregular mark on Hugh Jackman's nose and said quietly, "That wasn't there yesterday." Within 48 hours, Hugh was in surgery for his third basal cell carcinoma removal. The doctor explaining that decades of Australian sun exposure without protection had created a ticking time bomb across his face and shoulders. What the public didn't know was that Hugh had already had 2 previous removals secretly, scheduling surgeries between films, hiding bandages under Wolverine's makeup, returning to set the next day pretending nothing had happened. "My body could heal from anything on screen," Hugh reflected bitterly. "But in reality, it kept trying to kill me." The exact medical reality was more terrifying than any villain Wolverine faced. By 2023, Hugh had undergone 7 confirmed procedures for skin cancer, each one requiring larger margins of removal, deeper cuts, more aggressive treatment. His face became a map of barely visible scars that makeup artists worked overtime to conceal. He'd undergo Mohs surgery, removing cancer layer by layer while awake, then perform song and dance numbers that evening. The doctors warned that his type of recurring basal cell carcinoma had a 40% chance of returning within 5 years, essentially guaranteeing a lifetime of surgeries. "Every few months I wait to find out if my face is trying to kill me again," Hugh admitted. Behind the medical crisis was a deeper psychological battle. Hugh's anxiety disorder, managed since his 20s with medication he'd hidden from everyone except Deborah, exploded with each diagnosis. He'd have panic attacks before dermatologist appointments, convinced each mark was melanoma, each surgery would be disfiguring. He increased his medication, added therapy twice weekly, but couldn't shake the feeling that his body was abandoning him like his mother had, slowly, inevitably, painfully. The cancer felt like punishment, Hugh revealed, for all that Australian sun, but really for never being enough to make people stay. The physical impact went beyond cancer. 17 years of Wolverine had destroyed Hugh's body in ways the public never saw. His kidneys were damaged from dehydration cycles for shirtless scenes. His testosterone production had crashed from steroid cycling. His joints were arthritic from repetitive fight choreography. His back required constant treatment from a stunt gone wrong in 2013. But the most devastating was his vocal cords. Hemorrhage from 8 shows a week on Broadway, requiring surgery that might have ended his singing career. "I'd built my identity on my body's abilities," Hugh reflected. "Watching it fail was like watching myself disappear." The preventative measures became their own prison. Hugh couldn't go outside without SPF 100, wide-brimmed hats, and long sleeves even in summer. He'd have full-body skin checks every 3 months, each one triggering anxiety spirals. The man who'd played an invincible mutant now lived in fear of the sun, checking his skin obsessively, photographing every mark to track changes. "I became afraid of my own body," Hugh admitted. "Every new spot might be cancer. Every day became about what might kill me." "The irony isn't lost on me," Hugh told his oncologist after his 7th surgery. "I played a character who could heal from anything, and I can't heal from this. Logan's body was a miracle. Mine is a time bomb." The treatments continue: cryotherapy, topical chemotherapy, surgical removals that take pieces of him literally and figuratively. At 56, Hugh Jackman's face tells 2 stories, the one makeup covers for cameras and the one doctors map for cancer. The boy who lost his mother now watches his body leave him too, piece by surgical piece. The abandonment coming not all at once but in increments, which somehow makes it worse. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on September 5th, 2021, Father's Day in Australia, while Hugh was filming The Sun in London. His brother Ian's voice breaking as he delivered news that shattered Hugh's carefully constructed world. "Dad's gone." Christopher Jackman had died at 84 from a stroke, alone in his Sydney apartment, discovered by neighbors when newspapers piled up outside his door. The man who'd raised Hugh and his siblings alone after Grace left, who'd never remarried, who'd spent 45 years proving single fathers could be enough, died as he'd lived, quietly, without fuss, asking nothing from anyone. Hugh couldn't get back for 3 days due to COVID restrictions, trapped in London quarantine while his father lay in a Sydney morgue. "He died alone," Hugh would repeat obsessively. After everything he sacrificed, he died completely alone. The guilt about Christopher was crushing and specific. Hugh had been sending money for years, private nurses, better apartments, the best care money could buy, but hadn't visited in 18 months due to filming and pandemic restrictions. Their last conversation was about Hugh's work schedule, Christopher saying he understood, he was proud, don't worry about visiting. He spent his whole life saying he understood, Hugh reflected with devastating clarity. Understanding why Grace left, why I worked constantly, why everyone had somewhere more important to be than with him. But the deeper agony was the unresolved conversation about Grace. Christopher had never spoken badly about Hugh's mother, maintaining diplomatic silence for 45 years, taking her secrets to his grave. Hugh had planned to finally ask his father the real reason Grace left. Was there abuse, affairs, something that explained abandoning 5 children? Now he'd never know. Dad protected her even in death, Hugh realized. Protected the woman who destroyed him, because that's what good people do. They protect the ones who hurt them. The pattern of loss revealed Hugh's systematic failure with family. His brother Ralph, struggling with alcoholism, had distanced himself from the successful brother whose achievements felt like judgment. His sisters, who'd chosen to live with Grace in England, remained strangers Hugh saw at funerals and nowhere else. The family fractured by Grace's abandonment had never healed, just learned to perform normalcy at gatherings. "We were 5 siblings who shared DNA and damage," Hugh admitted. "Nothing more." But the loss that Hugh hides most carefully is the relationship with his mother Grace, still alive at 91 in England, who he visits annually for precisely 2 hours, timed visits that feel like prison appointments. She has dementia now, doesn't always recognize him, sometimes thinks he's Christopher. In lucid moments, she'll say things like, "You look tired," or "You work too much," the mundane observations of a stranger, not a mother. The cruelest thing, Hugh told his therapist, is that dementia gave her the excuse she never needed. Now she can't remember abandoning us, while I can't forget. "Every death teaches me the same lesson," Hugh reflected after Christopher's funeral, standing in the rain at Macquarie Park Cemetery, that I'm excellent at performing love but terrible at expressing it. I gave Dad money when he needed presents. I gave my siblings success they didn't ask for instead of the brother they needed. I gave Mother forgiveness she never requested. The boy who'd made himself perfect trying to earn love had become a man who confused achievement with affection, provision with presence. At 56, Hugh had lost the parent who stayed, maintained distance from the parent who left, and created a family with Deborah that ultimately couldn't survive his inability to stop performing long enough to simply be present. The abandoned boy had become an abandoning man, the cycle complete despite every effort to break it. By 2017, Hugh Jackman announced he was retiring from Wolverine after Logan, walking away from a role that guaranteed him $20 million per film, plus back-end profits that had earned him over $100 million across 17 years. The decision seemed insane. Fox was offering him $100 million for 3 more films. Disney's impending acquisition promised even more. But Hugh's body was breaking down from the role's physical demands, and his face was becoming a roadmap of skin cancer scars that took longer to hide. I was killing myself to play someone who couldn't die, Hugh reflected. The irony was lost on nobody, especially me. The financial impact of leaving Wolverine was immediate and severe. Hugh's quote dropped from $20 million to $5 million for non-franchise films. The Greatest Showman, his passion project, paid him scale wages up front with back-end promises that seemed unlikely. Fox had so little faith, they nearly went straight to streaming. The film that Hugh had developed for 7 years, that he believed would redefine him beyond Wolverine, tested so poorly that executives suggested shelving it entirely. I went from guaranteed millions to betting everything on a musical nobody wanted, Hugh admitted. Behind the scenes, Hugh's business ventures were hemorrhaging money. Seed Productions, his company with Deborra, had invested in multiple Broadway productions that failed, losses totaling $8 million that Hugh personally covered. His coffee company, Laughing Man Coffee, which donated profits to charity, operated at a loss for 5 years before he sold his stake for a fraction of his investment. The Australian production company he'd started to create opportunities back home folded after 2 failed projects. I thought success in one area meant I could succeed everywhere, Hugh reflected. Classic hubris with expensive consequences. The revelation of financial strain came through his real estate decisions. The $40 million property portfolio was leveraged heavily. Mortgages Hugh had assumed he'd easily cover with Wolverine money now consuming cash flow. He sold the Melbourne penthouse at a $2 million loss. The Hamptons estate went for $3 million under asking. The only property he kept was the New York apartment, now half empty after Deborah's departure. I was asset-rich but cash-poor, Hugh explained. The exact position my father was in after Mom left, history repeating. The slow reckoning came through accepting smaller projects. Reminiscence, a sci-fi film that went straight to streaming. Voice work for animations that paid a fraction of live action. Corporate appearances he'd previously declined, speaking at pharmaceutical conferences about skin cancer, private performances for tech billionaires. The man who'd hosted the Oscars was now hosting corporate retreats. You go from choosing projects to needing projects, Hugh observed. From artistic integrity to financial necessity. By 2024, Hugh Jackman's net worth had dropped from an estimated $180 million to roughly $100 million, still wealthy, but watching it diminish monthly. The divorce from Deborra would likely cost him half of what remained. His health expenses, constant cancer treatments, therapy, medication, consumed hundreds of thousands annually. The children's trust funds he'd established were solid, but his own future felt increasingly uncertain. At 56, he was taking any role offered, including returning to Wolverine for Deadpool 3, despite swearing he'd never wear the claws again, a $15 million payday he couldn't refuse. I said Logan was the perfect ending, Hugh admitted with bitter irony. But perfect endings are for people who can afford them. I'm back to being the dancing monkey, just an older, scarred version. The show goes on because the bills don't stop. By 2024, Hugh Jackman's appearance at the Deadpool and Wolverine premiere became uncomfortable viewing when he required multiple takes for red carpet interviews, forgetting his co-star's name mid-sentence while Ryan Reynolds covered with a joke, his hands trembling not from nerves but from medication adjustments for anxiety that had spiraled since his divorce. What the public didn't know was that Hugh had been experiencing severe depression following his separation from Deborra, sometimes unable to leave his New York apartment for days, surviving on protein shakes because cooking for one felt like admitting failure. At 56, the man who'd performed happiness for 5 decades couldn't remember what actual happiness felt like, only its performance. The cognitive impact of decades of anxiety medication was becoming visible. During recent interviews, Hugh would lose his train of thought mid-sentence, covering with his trademark laugh while panic rose behind his eyes. He'd forgotten lyrics during a charity performance of the Greatest Showman songs, standing frozen on stage for 30 seconds that felt like hours. The teleprompters that were once optional became mandatory. His photographic memory for scripts, names, and choreography, the skill that made him Broadway's most reliable leading man, was failing. "I used to remember everyone's lines," Hugh told his director. "Now I'm lucky if I remember my own." Public response to his return as Wolverine was brutal in its honesty. Social media dissected every frame, the CGI assistance for stunts, the body double usage, the obvious exhaustion beneath the acting. Comment sections filled with comparisons to 2000 Hugh versus 2024 Hugh, measuring the distance between peak and decline. The younger generation who discovered him through The Greatest Showman couldn't understand why this sad-looking man was playing a superhero. "He looks tired," became the common refrain, not knowing that tired was the kindest word for what Hugh actually was. The isolation had become complete architecture of performance. Hugh lived alone in the New York apartment that felt like a museum to ended marriage. Deborah's coffee mug still by the kitchen window, her reading chair untouched, the family photos neither removed nor looked at. Oscar and Ava visited dutifully but carefully, managing their father's moods like trained performers themselves. They'd learned to navigate his anxiety, his need for reassurance that they weren't angry about the divorce, his constant apologies for failing the family. "I raised them to perform happiness just like me," Hugh realized. The generational trauma continues. Recent attempts at dating felt like auditions he was failing. A dinner with a Broadway actress who spent the evening talking about his movies, not him. Coffee with a producer who wanted to discuss projects, not life. Every interaction felt transactional. They wanted Wolverine, or the Song and Dance Man, or the idea of Hugh Jackman, but not the 56-year-old man with cancer scars and anxiety medication and a mother who abandoned him. "I'm a character even in my personal life," Hugh admitted. "I don't know how to stop performing long enough to let anyone see who I actually am." "I've become what I always feared," Hugh told his therapist during a particularly dark session. "Someone who gets left." First Mum, now Deb, eventually everyone. The work continued through necessity. Marvel contracts, Broadway commitments, the machinery of fame that required Hugh Jackman to exist, even when Hugh the person was disappearing. At 56, he existed in permanent performance of wellness while privately wondering if he'd ever been well. If the abandoned 8-year-old boy at the window had simply learned to dance and sing and act his way through 5 decades without ever actually healing. The Greatest Showman had become his own greatest show, performing Hugh Jackman so convincingly that even he sometimes forgot it was performance. Today at 56, Hugh Jackman continues performing 8 shows a week when Broadway calls, despite vocal cords that require steroid injections and hands that shake from anxiety medication he's taken for 30 years. He rises alone in his New York apartment, Deborah's coffee mug still by the window, untouched since 2023, takes medication for conditions from basal cell carcinoma to chronic anxiety, and prepares for another day of being Hugh Jackman when he's still searching for Hugh. His net worth has diminished to $100 million, halved by divorce, drained by medical costs, sustained by returning to Wolverine after swearing he never would. The claws back on hands that now tremble, playing invincible while checking his skin for the 8th cancer surgery that's statistically inevitable. The truth in Hugh's story: sometimes the nicest guys are the most broken boys. The brightest smiles hide the deepest wounds, and you can make millions believe in happiness while never finding it yourself. If this moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories of those who remind us that even superheroes are just humans performing strength.